Everyone, thank you for being here today for this presentation. Before I begin though, I'd first like to thank my co-authors for all their help with this presentation. The research that I'll be presenting today covers about 30 years worth of Kestrel knowledge. So we've had a lot of contributors along the way, and this research couldn't have been done without these co-authors and just a ton of others along the way. So as climate change occurs, it's common for organisms to change the timing of their reproductive phenology, or the time at which they're reproducing. This has been seen all over the world. It includes organisms from almost every taxa. Amphibians like the smooth newt, reptiles like the three-lined skink, birds such as the Mexican jay, and mammals like the deer mice have all responded to climate change in a very similar way. As temperatures have warmed, they have all advanced the timing of their reproductive phenology. The hypotheses as to why organisms would change aspects of their breeding phenology primarily come from passerine systems. In these systems, warmer springs affect the plant phenology and insect emergence, causing both of them to begin their annual cycles earlier in the year. And as a result, the birds that feed on these insects nest earlier, so that their reproductive period, or the timing at which resources are in the highest demand, will better coincide with higher peaks in prey abundance. For example, in the Great Tit System in Europe, warmer springs have caused oak trees to begin to bud earlier. And as a response, 2 species of caterpillars have begun to emerge earlier. And in response, the tits have attempted to advance their reproductive period as well. And any failure to adequately advance their reproductive period has been shown to negatively affect their fitness. The research that I focused on has been on American Kestrels. So we began researching American Kestrels in southwestern Idaho around 1986, when we established 34 nest boxes. Since then, the program has grown, and we've averaged about 103 nest boxes a year. What's interesting about our study area is that we've noticed a trend. The Kestrels are now advancing their nesting period. And between the years of 1992 and 2015, Kestrels advanced their nesting period by 15 days. This research took place in a 1,000 square kilometer research area near Boise, Idaho. One of the things that I liked most about working in this study area is I felt like we really had this true mosaic of habitats. When you take a look at our study area here, you notice that it looks like on the left here, much more developed or agricultural lands. And then we get out to the side here, it's much more rural or more sagebrush steppe habitat. When we take a look at a single individual Kestrel's nest box here, represented by this green dot here in the center, and we place a 1 kilometer radius buffer around it, we notice that this Kestrel has access to sagebrush steppe habitat, agricultural fields, and 2 human-made structures, such as barns and houses. And what this does is it sets up the potential for both natural and human influences on the Kestrels in our study area. And so the advancement of Kestrel nesting phenology has been the primary focus of our research lab. And we've tested 2 main hypotheses to explain earlier nesting. The first one being that warmer winters have released former constraints, such as the need to migrate, on earlier nesting. And when this is combined with seasonal decline in fecundity, it can drive the advancement in nesting dates. And our second hypothesis is that shifts in growing season have led to earlier peaks in prey abundance, and Kestrels are potentially tracking these earlier peaks in prey. It's been well documented in another number of other studies that there are a lot of benefits to being an early breeding bird. It's shown that earliest pairs have produced the most young. There's higher apparent survival of those young that hatch early. And those young that are hatched early are more likely to be recruited into the breeding population. So with that knowledge being out there, and we knew that our kestrels were nesting earlier, we wanted to see if they were seeing similar or experiencing similar benefits. And what we found was that kestrels that are hatched earlier did have higher apparent survival and were more likely to recruit into the population, as was expected. What we're also finding is that early nesters have the potential for a second successful clutch. And this is something that we're starting to see more and more of over the last couple of years. The inherent drive for birds to breed as early as possible in the year to get all these fitness benefits has likely been held in check by climate, though, by these cold winters or cool springs and everything. But the climate's really beginning to change in Idaho. And what we're experiencing are significantly warmer winters. As seen in the speaker here on the bottom, year on the x-axis and average temperature anomaly on the y-axis. What we're showing here is these negative values represent much colder temperatures, and the positive values represent much warmer temperatures. And what we can see is during the winter, over time, we're getting much warmer. When we look at spring, we are not seeing a significant change to spring. And if anything, our temperatures during the spring are actually cooling. We know that whenever we look at temperature, there's a relationship between temperature during the winter and kestrel nesting the following spring. And what we have found is that in years with really warm winters, the kestrels actually nest earlier the following spring. And so in order to determine how kestrels may be responding to climate change, Heath et al. Began to search through the records that indicate where kestrels have been encountered. She began with the bird banding records from the bird banding lab. She looked at all western kestrels that have been encountered in the spring, so they've been banded in the spring, and then encountered elsewhere during the winter, or vice versa, from 1960 to 2009. She found 104 records of this. They also looked at Christmas bird count data for the same period, 1960 to 2009, in order to look at any shifts in the distribution of wintering kestrels. What they found was that in years with warmer winters, kestrels were migrating much shorter distances. And they were also increasing their tendency to overwinter these northern states and decreasing how far south they were wintering. And as a result, this led to the development of two populations of kestrels in our study area. We had these early breeding birds that were residents. We were seeing them during the winter, and then they were breeding much earlier the following spring. And we had these later breeding birds we presumed to be migrants. We were never seeing them during the winter. We were doing a lot of trapping, never encountering these birds in the winter. And when they did show up to our nest boxes, they were among our late breeders. And so the development of these two populations opened up a whole new avenue of research within our lab. Assortative or non-random mating could result in a quick population change. So Alexandra M studied this. She tested the hypothesis that the mating of resident birds only with residents, we know these to be the early breeding birds, and migrant birds only mating with migrant birds, who we know to be later breeders, could result in a genetic difference in our population. And if this was true, it could accelerate the shift towards early breeders because of all those inherent benefits of being the early breeding birds. So what Allie found was that resident birds were more likely to mate with other resident birds. And migrant birds were more likely to mate with migrant birds. And the resident birds were still nesting earlier than those non-resident birds. She did not find any evidence of a genetic difference between these two populations of birds. So there's still an overlap. We've not become two separate species, or groups of kestrels within our population. But we do have this group of early nesting early nesting resident still, and a late nesting non-resident. So we take another look at our first hypothesis here, that warmer winters are releasing these former constraints and causing earlier nesting. We found that this was true. Warmer winters caused kestrels to migrate shorter distances, and they were increasing their overwinter residency, leading to these two populations of kestrels in our study area. And in years with warmer winters, our kestrels were known to nest earlier the following spring. So after realizing that all of this was happening within our study area, we really wanted to know about the relationship between kestrel nesting and their prey sources. So kestrels are now nesting earlier, but how does this relate to their prey? So we developed a second hypothesis, that shifts in the growing season have led to earlier peaks in prey abundance, and kestrels are tracking these earlier peaks. And this research is based on the fact that we know growing seasons are changing all around the world. Many places are experiencing these longer growing seasons, and we know that farmers are planting these cold-tolerant crop strains, which are capable of being planted much earlier in the year without fear of a cold snap or a frost coming in and damaging those crops. We know that many organisms are responding to human decisions such as this. European starlings have advanced their nesting in agricultural areas following warmer winters, potentially due to farmers planting their crops earlier or changing their agricultural practices. And Eurasian blackcaps have changed their migration patterns due to supplemental bird feeding by backyard bird feeding and things like that, and the warmer temperatures that they're experiencing. So in order to test this hypothesis, I first determined that small mammals were a dominant prey item during the breeding season for our kestrels. And I did this using nest cameras at several of our boxes around our study area. I then linked peaks in small mammal abundance to growth patterns of vegetation. And this allowed me to establish a measurable proxy. I didn't have 30 years worth of small mammal data, but using satellites, I'm able to look at vegetation patterns for the last 30 years. I measured vegetation via satellite, and I focused on NDVI, which is essentially a measure of the greenness values of plants. And what I can do with this is I can estimate the start of the growing season as far back as we have Landsat data. I also analyzed Idaho crop progress and condition reports, and what these did was they told me exactly when farmers were beginning to plant their crops each year. And I determined that kestrels in our study area did have access to both agricultural areas and these sagebrush steppe habitats within a kilometer of each nest box. What I found was that between the period of 1992 and 2013, farmers were increasing the amount of each crop type planted at the start of each growing season. In this figure here, we have year on the x-axis and results from a model on the y-axis, which essentially tell us these high positive values mean more of a crop was planted, and these negative values indicate that less of a crop was planted beginning of the planting season. We've also found that during the same period, farmers planted their crops earlier in springs following warmer winters. So again, in this figure, we're bringing back those temperature anomalies. So negative values meaning much colder winters, positive values meaning these higher, warmer winters. And again, the amount planted on the y-axis here. So we see over on this side, in years where we're having these warmer winters, we were having much more of a crop planted. The key here was that between 1992 and 2013, spring significantly advanced by 26 days in agricultural areas, as seen here by this blue line, but it did not significantly change in these sagebrush steppe habitats. And what this means is that as farmers were planting these crops earlier and earlier and earlier, they were driving our growing season earlier by 26 days. And we know this measure of vegetation to represent these peaks in small mammal abundance. So by farmers choosing to plant their crops earlier in the year, they were causing these earlier peaks in small mammal abundance to occur. So we believe that earlier nesting of kestrels in our study area can be explained by both of our hypotheses. As climate change is occurring, we're getting these much warmer winters, our kestrels are migrating shorter distances, and they're overwintering farther north, potentially near their breeding grounds. And by humans adapting to climate change, by planting these crops earlier in the year because of these warm winters, we're going to be seeing earlier peaks in prey abundance. And kestrels are nesting earlier in response to these earlier peaks in prey. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of the undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, everybody who's worked on this project over the last 30 years. And a very special thank you to all the Idaho landowners that we've had that have allowed us to continuously access their nest boxes year after year. As you can imagine, with all this years of research, we've got a lot of different funding sources. So I'd like to thank NSF, Boise State Raptor Research Center, and the Biological Sciences Department. The Golden Eagle Audubon Society helped to fund my research, and Peregrine Fund and American Kestrel Partnership. So with that,